When my best friend Cal and I started the channel, it was all for fun. Urban exploring in New York City had been our thing for years, and YouTube was just a way to share it. Abandoned buildings, forgotten hotels, that was our brand. But as our channel grew, so did the demands of our audience. They wanted the extreme, the more hidden parts of NYC. It was Cal's idea to investigate these sewer people rumor. "Think about it, man," he said one night, eyes gleaming. "A whole network of people living under the city. If we're the first to get that on camera, we'll blow up." I couldn't deny the appeal. Rumors had circulated for decades about the shadowy figures who lurked below New York, scavenging, surviving off rats and whatever the city had discarded. But like most urban legends, I assumed the stories were exaggerated. Cal and I spent hours prepping for the sewer dive, making sure that we had everything we would need to face whatever was down there. We packed our bags with essentials, extra water, enough to last us a few hours, and spare batteries for the flashlights, since darkness would be our worst enemy. I grabbed a few granola bars too, just in case we got stuck down there longer than planned. To keep any sewer pests at bay, we duct taped our pant legs and sleeves, sealing off every gap to make sure that nothing small and unwelcome could find its way in. With our gear packed and GoPros ready, we made our way to a manhole cover in a quiet corner of the city. Cal pried it open, the metal scraping against concrete with an echoing screech, and we peered down into the black void below. The stench hit us first, a mix of mold and filth. Cal shot me a quick look, a mix of excitement and nervousness on his face. "Well, I guess this is it," he said before turning on his GoPro. He shot me a grin before he went down first, his flashlight beam slicing into the darkness. One rung at a time, I followed him, my hands gripping the rusty metal as we descended into the underbelly of the city. The sounds of the street above faded with each step, replaced by the steady movement of water echoing around us and the hum of distant machinery. When our feet hit the wet concrete below, we stood there in the dim beam of our flashlights, our eyes adjusting to the darkness. The walls were slick with grime and patches of mildew growing along the cracked cement. Somewhere in the dark, we heard a faint scuttle, the unmistakable skitter of rats just out of sight. Among the gear, I had packed several rolls of reflective tape. In these dark and winding tunnels, getting turned around would be all too easy, and the last thing that we wanted was to get lost down here. Every few yards, I peeled off a strip and slapped it on the wall, watching as it shined in the beam of our flashlights like a tiny beacon marking our way back. It felt reassuring, each piece of tape reflecting back to us, a reminder that we had a trail back to the exit, no matter how far in we ventured. For a while, this routine was all that we had, exploring the narrow tunnels, stepping around filth and cockroaches, chatting to our cameras, cracking jokes to mask the tension. We spoke in low voices, our words bouncing off the walls and echoing down the tunnels. Every so often we would hear scuttling and faint splashes of water, but nothing more. No signs of human life, no movement. I started to wonder if the stories about these sewer people were just nothing more than rumors. I told Cal as much. "I gotta say, man, I'm starting to think this stuff about sewer people is just bullshit." "Yeah, you're probably right. We'll push a little bit further and then we'll head back," Cal replied. We kept pushing further. The smell had been bad from the start, but now it was clawing its way into my head, thick and unrelenting. Every breath felt like I was swallowing damp rot mixed with decay, the odor sinking into my lungs. My stomach started to twist and churn. I gagged, pulling at my shirt over my nose in a useless attempt to filter the air, but it barely helped. The feeling of nausea and claustrophobia began to take a hold of me. I glanced at Cal, who seemed focused, oblivious to my growing panic. I started to feel like the walls of the sewer were inching closer, getting tighter around us. My chest tightened, breaths coming in shallower, and the concrete felt like it was pressing down on me. We were far away from our exit now, from fresh air, from daylight, and the reality of how deep we had ventured hit me. I wanted to turn around, to trace our way back to the manhole and climb out into the open air. I forced myself to take another breath, hoping that it would steady me, but all it did was fill my lungs with that choking, nauseating stench. "Hey, Cal, I think it's time we get the hell out of here," I said. Cal paused a moment, considering what I had said. I knew that he was fumbling inside his brain, trying to decide if we had gotten enough footage for a video. All right, yeah, let's go," he finally replied. Just as we were about to turn back, I felt something crunch beneath my boot. A sharp, brittle sound that sent a shiver up my spine. I froze, the weight of my foot still pressing down on whatever I had stepped on. "Oh, gross, what the hell?" I muttered, lifting my foot carefully and instinctively, shining my flashlight downward. The beam caught it instantly, casting a light on a line of severed rat heads stretched out across the floor in front of us. Each one was cleanly cut, like they had been sliced off with a blade, neat and precise, the way a cook might prepare a fresh chicken. Their dead eyes stared up blankly, fur still glistening with damp, white rows of teeth that gaped out of tiny mouths in frozen agony. And there were dozens of them, arranged in a long trail leading deeper into the sewer, like some type of twisted bread trail. Cal's light joined mine, and I heard a sharp intake of breath as he took in the scene. We both stood there speechless. A faint smell of something else joined us, a dead smell, something like sulfur. I felt my pulse quicken, a wave of nausea rising in my throat as I stared at the trail of severed heads. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to get out of here before whatever had left this realized that we were here. It felt like something that we weren't supposed to see. "We need to leave, man," I said, my voice coming out quieter than I meant. I glanced over at Cal, but he was still focused on the trail of rat heads, his flashlight sweeping back and forth. "Hey, we've seen enough. No video's worth all of this." Cal didn't respond right away. He just kept looking at the heads, and then finally he turned to me, his eyes intense. "No, we need to go further," he said, his voice steady but with a fire beneath it. "This is exactly why we're here. This isn't just some random mess. Whatever did this, they cut these off clean. A person did this." I felt a cold pit form in my stomach. I didn't want to know who or what would do that. "Cal, that's insane. People don't just..." I cut myself off, my words getting tangled. "We're in over our heads here, man. We don't need the video that bad." But Cal was already shaking his head, his eyes wide, his excitement slowly turning to obsession. "No, we do need to find it. Think about it. We actually found something, right? This is what we came for. We've been talking about this for months and now we have proof, man. This is the real deal." I opened my mouth to argue, but Cal was already moving, stepping forward. I hesitated. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to stop him, to pull him back, but I couldn't. Something about his conviction pulled me in, even though every instinct was telling me to run the hell out of there. I paused for a moment before following him further into the sewers. As we ventured deeper into the tunnels, I couldn't help but notice the appearance of the sewer began to change. The smell, while still overwhelmingly foul, had begun to change in subtle ways, less stagnant. The walls, which had been slick with grime and mildew just moments before, began to appear oddly cleaner. The thick layers of mold were replaced with smooth concrete. It looked as though this area of the sewer was more maintained than the rest of it. I glanced at Cal, wondering if he was noticing it too. He didn't say anything, but I saw the way his flashlight flickered over the walls, a growing unease creeping into his expression. We were no longer in the decaying, forgotten part of the sewer system, but in some other area, one that looked cared for and used. The tunnels felt more structured now, the path straightening, and the walls narrowing just slightly, giving the whole space a more controlled and less abandoned feel. It was unsettling in a way that I couldn't explain. We kept moving, drawn by the hope of capturing something for the video, but I felt my nerves increasing with every step. The rats had all but disappeared also, like even they knew to avoid this area. The deeper we went, I started to notice something. At first, it was so faint that I thought that I might have imagined it. It was a low, rumbling sound, like the hum of machinery, a deep growl vibrating through the walls. I stopped in my tracks, holding up a hand to signal to Cal. He turned, raising his flashlight in my direction. I could see the question in his eyes before he spoke. "You hear that?" I nodded. "Yeah, what the hell is that?" We stood there for a moment listening. The sound was still distant, but it was undeniable now, a persistent low roar. My heart started to pick up pace. "Let's keep going," Cal said, his voice tinged with excitement. "I think we're getting close to something." I hesitated, but Cal had already started moving forward again. Against my better judgment, I followed him. As we pressed on, the sound grew louder and we realized something unsettling. It wasn't a roar at all. It was voices, a low murmur like a chorus, layered and overlapping. Dozens, maybe hundreds, all blending together in a constant, unintelligible hum. The closer we got, the more it became like a crowd, the way a school lunchroom sounds when you're standing in the hallway. Chatter, laughter, some raised voices, all of it happening at once. I shivered involuntarily. This wasn't what I had expected to find when we had started this. I didn't know what I expected to find down here, but it was not this. Cal's eyes darted around, scanning the walls and the tunnel ahead. Curiosity, obsession. I could see it in him, a hunger to know what was just beyond that next bend. And I couldn't deny it. I was just as desperate to know. I felt my pulse race as if we were on the verge of discovering something huge, something we were never supposed to find. We pushed forward, each step in sync now as we approached the source of the noise. The voices grew clearer, louder, and yet still completely unintelligible, a garbled blend of human sounds. "Stay close," I murmured, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. We rounded a corner and the source of the noise came into view. I froze. My flashlight flickered in the dim light and I nearly dropped it. We had entered a massive clearing in the middle of the sewer system. It was like some kind of underground hub, a junction, a place where several tunnels converged, creating a central location. There were dozens, no hundreds of people. They were dirty, grime was smeared on their skin, their clothes ragged, some in nothing more than tattered scraps of fabric, others in what looked like makeshift clothes, pieced together from whatever they could find in the tunnels. Some had bandages wrapped around their arms and heads, others limped as they shuffled around the clearing. They looked wrong, hunched over, disjointed. Their limbs moved with jerky, unnatural motions like they didn't fully understand how to walk properly anymore. Their faces were obscured by the shadows, but I could see the glint of eyes that were too wide and too bright, like they had been adapted to the darkness. We didn't belong here. No normal person does. They muttered and grunted to each other, their speech broken and garbled. The few words that escaped their lips sounded like a twisted form of English, nothing coherent, just guttural sounds. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I took in the scene. This was wrong. These weren't homeless people or squatters living down here. They were something else, something more. And then my eyes locked onto something that made my breath catch. At the center of the clearing, standing on a raised platform made of old, broken concrete, was the leader. The man, if he could even be called that, was tall or had been at some point. but now his posture was crooked, hunched over like a vulture. He wore a crown, something pieced together from what I assumed were rat bones, broken shards of glass, and bits of trash from the sewer. It looked grotesque, a twisted mockery of something royal. The crown was perched unevenly on his black, oily, matted hair, but I could see the glint of his eyes as he surveyed the crowd, his expression calm, like he was the ruler of this entire underground kingdom. It was all so surreal. These people, if they could even be called that anymore, were standing in this cavernous space. In the center, they were surrounding a massive pile of rats. Hundreds of them, maybe more. They were piled high in the center with the leader overseeing the rat feast like some kind of grotesque ritual. Jesus Christ, it's real. I heard Cal mutter beside me. He wasn't even trying to hide the awe in his voice. I could feel the fear crawling up my spine now, the air pressing down on me like a weight. This was no longer just some urban legend. This was real, and we were standing in the middle of it. As I stood frozen in place, trying to process what I was seeing, a new sound pierced through the murmur of voices. A low, distant shuffling at first, but then it grew louder from behind us. I turned, my heart leaping in my chest. Figures were emerging from the dark tunnels behind us, their silhouettes barely visible. At first, there were just a few, but then it turned into a flood. Dozens of these people stumbling toward the center of the clearing. They were coming from all directions like ants pouring out of their hills, drawn by some instinctual need. They moved with urgency and with purpose, but at the same time there was a strange disjointedness to their movements. Some of them shuffled and some of them crawled, and others just seemed to drag their limbs along like they hadn't walked in years. The stench grew stronger as they piled in. The rancid, sour smell of bodies and decay thickened in the air, mixing with the overpowering scent of rats. I could feel it choking me, making me gag as my stomach heaved. As the bodies poured in from behind us, the next thing I knew we were being shoved forward, pushed into the heart of the crowd. The smell was suffocating now, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as the noise grew louder. The voices of the sewer people mingling with a chorus of strange guttural sounds that made my skin crawl. We weren't just watching anymore, we were now standing in the crowd. We had joined it. Shit, I said, my feet stumbling as I was pushed further into the group. I felt hands brush against my arms, cold and clammy. I tried to push back to fight my way free, but the crowd was too strong and too dense. My flashlight bounced wildly in my hand as I was shoved again, deeper into the center of the clearing. People, things, limbs were bumping against me, pressing in from all sides, their skin slick and cold with grime. I could hear their breathing, it was heavy and labored, and the low guttural muttering as they moved past us. And then I saw it, the leader standing on his makeshift platform staring down at the chaos unfolding below. The glass and jagged rat bones in his crown seemed to gleam in the dim light. He raised his hand slowly, and in that moment, the entire crowd fell silent. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew that it wasn't good. I could feel my chest tightening, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I looked around. The people were all staring now, some with wide, hungry eyes. The king, as I started to think of him, raised his hand again, a slow, deliberate motion that commanded the crowd. His eyes flicked from person to person, and as if on cue, the crowd began to shuffle forward toward the massive pile of rats in the center of the clearing. One by one, people stepped forward, bent down and grabbed rats from the pile. They didn't hesitate, their hands trembling as they selected their prize, some ripping the poor creatures free from the heap like they were choosing cuts of meat at a butcher's stall. And then they turned and retreated back to the edges of the clearing, crouching down to wait patiently. A sick realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This was some kind of feast. My heart raced as the crowd shifted, pushing me closer to the rats. I looked over at Cal, but his expression was distant, his face flushed with something that I couldn't place. His eyes were fixed on the rats. I felt the crowd pushing me forward, and before I could even think about what I was doing, I was right there standing at the edge of the pile. The rats were piled high, some of them twitching, others limp, their bodies cold and stiff. The scent of death hung thick in the air, a noxious mix of decay and rot that clung to the back of my throat. I didn't dare breathe too deeply. Not now. I glanced around at the others, at the people who had already taken their rats, and saw that no one was looking at me. No one was paying attention. The last thing that I wanted was to be discovered as an outsider, someone who didn't belong. I couldn't risk it. And so with shaking hands, I bent down and I grabbed a rat. It was cold and stiff beneath my fingers, its fur matted and slick with felt. The weight of it was almost comical at first, like I was holding something that didn't belong in my hands. But I held on to it tightly, trying to ignore the disgust that bubbled up in my throat. Up close, the pile of rats was even more massive than I thought. It was a huge, mountainous pile. There were thousands of them, more than I could ever count. Their eyes were wide open, frozen in a permanent state of terror, their little bodies twisted and mangled. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine as I imagined the horror of whatever had made them like this. But the people around me were all so calm, so unbothered by it. It was as if this was all normal. I could feel the tension building inside me, but I gritted my teeth and held onto the rat, walking slowly head down, back towards the edges of the crowd, just like the others had done. I couldn't let anyone know. I couldn't let them see that I was different, that I was scared, that I didn't belong here. I swallowed hard and forced my legs to move, my body stiff and rigid as I made my way through the crowd. The moment felt endless. Every step felt like a violation. I could feel the eyes of the sewer people on me. I could sense their gaze following me as I walked past, the oppressive weight of their attention pressing down on me. But I didn't look up. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, my hands clenching around the rat, my mind begging me to run. When I reached the edge of the crowd, I crouched down just like everyone else. I sat on the cold and damp floor, holding the rat in my lap, my hands shaking as I tried to force myself to calm down. But I couldn't. I couldn't stop the panic from creeping in. Couldn't stop my mind from screaming that I was in too deep, that I was surrounded by people who were no longer human. And yet I had just done the same thing that they had, picked a rat from the pile just like them. I knew that something was about to happen, something horrible, something that I wasn't ready for, but I had no choice but to wait. I sat there in the filthy, rat-infested sewers surrounded by hundreds of people who were no longer people. I hoped that this rat wasn't going to be the last thing that I ever saw. And then, with a guttural and broken voice that seemed to scrape against the very air itself, the king bellowed, "Eat!" The sound that followed was like nothing that I had ever heard before, like the gnashing of wild animals tearing at fresh meat, the sound of skin being shredded and bones cracking under the weight of a savage hunger. The crowd erupted in a frenzy. The rats, still limp in their hands, were immediately ripped open. Flesh was torn away in great and savage chunks, and fur flew everywhere in the dim flickering light of the flashlights. The guttural sounds of gnawing and tearing filled the air, mingling with the sickeningly wet squelch of flesh being ripped apart. I couldn't tear my eyes away even though I wanted to, even though every part of me screamed to run. But my legs refused to move and my body was frozen and paralyzed with both fear and disgust. I tried to block out the sounds, the images, tried to convince myself that it wasn't real. But no matter how tightly I shut my eyes, these sounds wouldn't stop. And then, through my blurred vision, through the tears that blurred my sight, I saw him. A man kneeling beside me, staring directly at me with an unblinking, curious look in his eyes. His face was covered in grime, his teeth stained with dark red, but it was the expression in his eyes that froze me. It wasn't hunger, it wasn't madness. It was curiosity. A chill ran down my spine, and I knew then that he was studying me, trying to figure out if I was one of them, if I was a part of the feast. The realization hit me like a blow to the gut. My heart started pounding, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I had no choice. I had to blend in. I had to eat. I hesitated. If I faltered for even a second, I knew that I would be exposed. I couldn't risk it. Without thinking, without even acknowledging what I was doing, I leaned down and brought the rat up to my mouth. The scent of decay hit me first, the stench of rot, of death. I almost gagged at the thought of it, but I pushed it down and forced myself to swallow my pride and my fear. I tore into the rat. The meat was cold and rubbery, its flesh stringy and tough. My teeth sunk into it, but the texture was wrong, so wrong. I could taste the filth in the rat's skin, the decay that clung to its bones. My stomach lurched, but I forced myself to swallow, to pretend that it didn't make me sick. I could feel his eyes on me, the man beside me still watching as if waiting for me to flinch, to break, to betray myself. I couldn't let him see it. I couldn't let anyone see it. I kept chewing even though I wanted to vomit, even though I wanted to scream. The crowd around me was consumed by their own feeding frenzy, ripping, tearing, devouring the rats with an almost animalistic fervor. The sound of gnashing teeth and guttural growls filled the air, drowning out everything else. When I glanced back toward the man, he wasn't watching me anymore. He was tearing into his own rat. I knew that I had done it. I had succeeded. With everyone preoccupied with their meal, I decided now was my chance to escape. Crouching low, I made my way through the crowd, toward the tunnel which we had come. I tried to find Cal in the crowd, but he was nowhere to be seen. In a moment of internal conflict, I tried to decide whether to stay and look for him or whether to leave. Cal must have left already. He's probably already halfway back to the surface, I convinced myself. I tried to reassure myself of this, but it did little to calm the growing panic in my chest. Still, I knew that I couldn't stay. If I waited too long and if I kept looking for him, I would draw attention to myself. I had no choice. With a deep breath, I turned away from the crowd, my legs barely holding me as I crept back toward the tunnel. My heart raced, pounding in my ears almost louder than the cacophony of noise behind me. Every step felt like it could be my last, but I didn't stop. I moved swiftly, but as quietly as possible, my hands shaking as I gripped my flashlight. The stench of decay still clung to the air, mixing with the sickly metallic tang of blood. I could hear them behind me, voices, grunts, the sound of tearing, gnashing teeth, but none of it mattered now. The only thing that mattered to me was getting back to the surface. I didn't look back, I couldn't afford to, but in the back of my mind, that question still echoed. Where was Cal? Relief started to creep in as soon as I saw the familiar grimy walls of the tunnel again. My flashlight cast weak beams of light on the wet surface, and for a brief moment, it felt like I was back in the world that I knew, safe. I moved faster now, the echo of my footsteps ringing in the silence of the tunnel. The overwhelming stench of the rats, the blood, and the decay was fading with every step that I took away from the nightmare. I focused on the tape, the reflective strips that I had laid down earlier, each piece glinting faintly as I passed. The orange markings were a lifeline, a trail leading me back to the surface. My legs ached, but the relief of being out of that hellish clearing, the noise of the feast growing more distant with each step, made my pulse steady a little. Just then, passing by an intersection of tunnels, my flashlight cut through the shadows, illuminating something, someone. I stopped dead in my tracks. It was one of them, a child, a sewer child. They were alone. Their eyes were wide, bloodshot, their skin pale and filthy, the same ragged clothes as the others. We stood there staring at each other for what felt like an eternity. They didn't move, and neither did I. My brain screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were frozen in place. For a split second, the world seemed to hold its breath. In an instant, their eyes widened, their lips curling into something resembling a hiss. Without a word, without hesitation, they bolted, rushing past me with surprising speed. I stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the realization crashing over me. They were running back to the clearing to alert the others. Panic surged through me, and in that split second, I turned and ran, heart pounding in my ears. My lungs were on fire, each breath coming in sharp and desperate gasps. My legs felt like they were made of stone, but I did not stop running. The tape whizzed by, just a blur of orange as I sped past it, barely able to keep track of where I was. Finally, I saw the ladder. My heart skipped a beat. The rungs were barely visible in the faint light, but I could make them out just enough. I shoved myself toward it, my hands trembling as I grabbed hold, yanking myself upward. The manhole cover was still off. I could see daylight streaming through the opening. The outside world and safety was just a few feet away. I didn't hesitate. My hands scrambled for the ladder as I hauled myself up, every muscle in my body screaming, but I didn't care. Freedom was right there just above me. I pushed harder and harder until the light hit my face, and I crawled out into the daylight, gasping for air, my heart still pounding in my chest. The first thing that I did when I stumbled out into the light was vomit. It hit me all at once, violent and uncontrollable. My stomach twisted, and before I could even catch my breath, the black, disgusting bile came up. It wasn't just any vomit, it was thick, putrid, and oily, like something from a nightmare. My body convulsed, and I couldn't stop it. The rat that I had eaten, the taste, the texture, the sickening act of it came rushing back. I threw up everywhere, all over the ground, the reek of rotten bile filling the air. I barely had time to brace myself before it came again. It was like my insides were churning as if they wanted to escape my body entirely. The horror of what I had just done, what I had been forced to do, felt like it was coming out of me in waves. I looked around, hoping, praying that Cal had managed to make it out before me, but there was no sign of him. I waited outside of the manhole for hours, pacing back and forth, staring at the dark hole, hoping that he would appear out of it, safe and sound. But he never did. I went to the police, my hands shaking as I tried to explain what we had seen, what I had experienced down there. I showed them the GoPro footage, hoping that they would take it seriously. I thought for a moment that they might. A detective brought me into a room and watched the footage on my camera. They took the GoPro and assured me that they would take care of it. For a moment, I believed them and felt a feeling of relief, but as I left the police station that day, deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just made a huge mistake. When I went back to the station to check in, they acted like they had no idea who I was. They denied ever having talked to me, denied ever seeing the footage. And then to make it worse, they threatened to arrest me for trespassing if I didn't leave the station immediately. The footage, the evidence, it was all gone. They never gave it back to me. They covered it up and acted like it had never happened. Cal was reported missing, but they chalked it up to him just running away, maybe with a girl or something. He was an adult after all. I've never seen him again, and I know now with a sickening certainty that he either got discovered by them and met a terrible fate, or arguably worse, he's still down there, trapped, forced to join them, that he's now one of them. When I got the call about my father's death, I decided to drive straight across the country to the funeral. I wasn't very close with my father, and it wasn't out of the need of closure, no. It was for the inheritance my mother told me that I couldn't have unless I came. While I wasn't keen on the idea of seeing my family, I could definitely use the money. No need to overcomplicate things. Drive there, get in, get out. That was the plan. I was traveling through the middle of nowhere, Iowa when it happened. My Chevy began to sputter and my engine light began to blink. I cursed and I flicked on the emergency lights and I coasted onto the shoulder, my car coming to rest with a final pathetic cough. Grabbing my phone, I checked for service. Of course, there was none. I hadn't seen another car or a sign of life for miles. I recalled seeing a rundown gas station a couple of miles back and decided making the walk was my only option. Shit, I muttered to myself, stepping out of the car. The road was eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. The wind rustled the corn, an occasional gust carrying with it a thick earthy scent. I locked my car and I started walking. I arrived just as the sun began to set, sweaty, exhausted, and thirsty. The gas station, like most things around here, seemed stuck in time. A rusty sign that read, Harper's Fuel and Goods, hung above the single-weathered fuel pump out front. A faint buzzing noise came from the flickering open neon light in the window. I pushed the door open. The bell above jingled weakly, barely audible. The inside was dimly lit, shelves lined with old cans of beans, dusty bottles of water, and a few bags of chips. Behind the counter sat an old man as thin as a scarecrow, his skin weathered. He had a calm, distant look in his eyes, as though he had been waiting for someone for a long time. "Car trouble, I take it?" he asked, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Yeah, broke down a couple of miles up the road. No service either." I tried to sound casual, but something about the place made me uneasy. In my mind, I was thinking this place looked just like the kind of gas station in horror movies, just before the main character is being chased by a group of inbred killers. He nodded slowly, eyes never leaving mine. "Ain't much for signal out here. Nearest town's quite a ways off." "Yeah, I figured," I said, glancing around the store. "Any chance you know of any motels or somebody that could tow me?" His lips pulled into a slow and thin smile. "Well, I ain't no tow man, but I reckon that I can help. I live just up the road, got some tools back at the farm. You can stay the night and we'll see about fixing your car in the morning." I hesitated. The offer set off alarms in my head, but what other choice did I have? My legs already ached and my stomach was empty. Making the walk back to my car didn't seem like an option. "All right," I said finally. "Yeah, thanks, I appreciate it." Frank's truck was old and rusted, the engine loud as we rattled down a dirt road. The field stretched out on either side, the setting sun casting long shadows over the corn stalks. The farm came into view, a white, weathered house surrounded by a couple of barns and a silo. It looked like the kind of place that time had forgotten, untouched by anything modern. The paint was peeling and the porch sagged, but hey, it was home. Far better than the empty road behind me. As we pulled up, the porch light flickered on and I saw them. An older woman, 2 young adults, and 2 younger children standing on the steps. They stood perfectly still, watching the truck approach. We stepped out of the truck. "That there's my wife Sue," Frank said, "and our kids, John and Mary, and their little ones, Billy and Ruth." I was confused for a moment at the way that he introduced them. John and Mary's little ones. "Do you mean—" No, I must have been mistaken. An awkward moment of silence passed as I was stuck in my thoughts. "Nice to meet you all, thanks for having me," I forced out. "Kid here has some car troubles. I told him that he could stay with us for the night," Frank told Sue. There was something strange about their faces, a certain dullness to their expressions. Still, I forced a polite smile. Sue smiled warmly as I approached, wiping her hands on a faded apron. "Oh, you must be hungry. Supper's almost ready. You're welcome to join us." "Thank you," I said, shaking her hand. Her grip was firm and her skin felt rough and calloused in a way that spoke of years of hard labor. The two other, younger adults, John and Mary, stood by the door, watching me without a word. Their eyes were unblinking and their lips were thin. Something about them gave me the creeps. They were like mirror images of one another, twins maybe. The children, Billy and Ruth, were even more unsettling. Their features were distorted, with wide gap-toothed smiles and crooked eyes, and heads that seemed too large for their small bodies. They clung to their mother's dress, their eyes wide and unblinking. Frank ushered me inside before I had time to dwell on it. The house was dimly lit, the walls lined with faded wallpaper and old wooden furniture. The smell of cooked meat filled the air, mingling with the smell of mold. It was a heavy smell and it made my stomach churn. The dining room was small with a long wooden table in the center. Plates were already set and Sue wasted no time in serving up slabs of meat and mashed potatoes. The food looked hearty enough, but something about it didn't sit right with me. The meat was dark and almost black in places, and the potatoes were watery, pooling at the bottom of the plate. "Eat up," Sue said, settling down across from me. Frank sat at the head of the table and the children lined either side. Their eyes never left me, watching with the same blank expression as I picked up my fork. "So, where you headed?" Frank asked, breaking the silence. Funeral," I said. "Out in Ohio, just passing through." Sue clucked her tongue sympathetically. "Oh, that's a long way. You'll need your strength for a trip like that." I nodded, taking a tentative bite. The meat was tough, its texture stringy and oily, and the taste was metallic. I forced it down, feeling bile rise up in my throat. "You don't talk much, do ya?" Frank asked, his grin widening. "Oh, sorry, I'm just tired," I muttered, glancing around the table. The kids were still watching me, their eyes unnervingly wide, their heads bobbing slightly with every bite they took. The longer that I sat there, the more that I felt the walls closing in around me. The house was stifling, the air thick and oppressive. The food sat like a stone in my stomach. "Well, you'll sleep good tonight. Ain't nothing out here but peace and quiet," Frank said, his smile never fading. The bedroom they offered me was small, just a single bed with an old sagging mattress, a nightstand, and a dresser. The window overlooked the cornfield, stretching out endlessly into the night. The room smelled faintly of mildew and the wallpaper was peeling off in places. As I sat on the bed, it creaked under my weight. I tried to relax, but something about the house felt off. The way the family had stared at me all throughout dinner, the strange, almost robotic way they moved, was all too much. The bed was uncomfortable, but exhaustion started to creep in. I lay back, staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house settling in for the night. "I'll be out of here tomorrow," I reminded myself. And that's when I heard the door creak open down the hallway. I froze, listening as footsteps, slow and deliberate, moved down the hallway. I got up quietly, listening when I heard the front door open. I made my way to the window, peering through the thin curtains. Frank and his family were heading out into the yard, moving in a single file line toward the barn. The two younger children, Billy and Ruth, followed behind, their misshapen heads bobbing as they walked. There was something disturbingly ritualistic about their movement, a strange, silent procession under the moonlight. They reached the barn and one by one they disappeared inside. My heart pounded in my chest. Every instinct told me not to follow, but something stronger, some morbid curiosity, pushed me to find out what they were doing in there. I slipped out of the room, moving quietly down the stairs and out the front door. The night air was cold, biting at my skin as I made my way toward the barn, and the smell of something else, a decay, got stronger with every step closer to the barn. When I reached the barn, the doors were slightly ajar, just enough for me to peer inside. What I saw stopped my heart. The family stood in a circle around a crude wooden altar. Each of them wore the head of a cow, real cow heads and not masks. The flesh was rotting and the eyes were hollowed out, leaving only dark, gaping holes for them to peer out of. The heads were stitched to ragged cowhide robes that hung off their bodies. The smell inside the barn was unbearable, the smell of rotting meat and death. But it wasn't the family that made my blood run cold. It was what stood in the center of the altar. This thing was massive, its body a grotesque fusion of man and cow. Its legs were bent and twisted, ending in hooves, but its torso was humanoid, muscular and covered in patches of matted fur. Its arms were long, too long, with fingers that ended in sharp blackened nails, but its head was the most horrifying part. It was part human, part cow, its face distorted and deformed. One side was mostly human with a bulging eye and a misshapen mouth that hung open, revealing rows of jagged and yellowed teeth. The other side was more cow than man, with a long snout-like nose and a single milky eye that seemed to ooze with pus. From the top of its skull protruded massive curved horns, slick with some kind of dark liquid that dripped onto the altar below. On top of its head was a large crude crown made of sticks and vine. It let out a low, guttural sound, a mixture of a moo and a scream that vibrated through the air. Frank fell to his knees before it, holding up a bowl filled with something thick and red. He muttered something under his breath, a chant that I couldn't understand. The creature leaned forward, dipping its monstrous head toward the bowl, lapping at the thick red liquid with a long black tongue. "Our king, tonight we bring you an offering," John and Mary said in unison. My stomach lurched and bile rose in my throat. I backed away, my breathing coming in ragged gasps, every fiber of my being screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. The creature's milky eye rolled in its socket, and for a moment, it seemed to lock onto me. Its lips curled into something that resembled a smile, revealing more of those sharp and rotten teeth. I turned and bolted. I ran blindly through the dark, my feet pounding against the dirt path as I sprinted back toward the house. I heard the sound of the barn doors swinging open and the family yelling after me. My heart hammered in my chest, adrenaline surging through my veins, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. When I reached the house, I didn't bother with the door. I made a beeline for the truck parked in the yard, yanking open the door and praying that the keys were still inside, and they were. I fumbled with the ignition, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The engine roared to life just as I heard the sound of footsteps gaining on me. I didn't look back. I slammed the truck into gear and I tore off down the road, the tires kicking up dust as I sped away from that cursed place. I drove until the first signs of civilization appeared on the horizon, until I found a diner where I could stop and breathe. I never went to my father's funeral. Something about seeing something so horrifying and twisted made the inheritance feel irrelevant. Every night I dream of that thing appearing in my room and dragging me back to that barn. I'll never drive through Iowa again.